Welcome and thank you for joining us. This is the 6th module of continuing education related to school HACCP and school food safety. Today we'll be talking about temperatures and best practices related to cooling and storing food, how temperature impacts the growth and survival of harmful pathogens, and to touch on some issues related to contamination and pest control in storage. This module will provide 1 hour of continuing education for the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction in the School Nutrition Key Area of Operations Area of General Food Safety. Cooling and storage are two of the biggest areas of concern in all of food service, retail, restaurants, and institutions when it comes to food safety problems. We see problems related to cooling and storage over and over again, and can identify cooling and storage problems as the causes of many foodborne illnesses. Historically, we focused on temperatures, especially during the cooling and storage process, as the causes of foodborne illness. Let's explore this history with a brief story or two. What we know about the science of cooling, how certain bacteria grow in certain conditions, comes from a large outbreak in the early 1970s in a high school in Texas. A high school hosted a dinner for their students, and somewhere between 80 and 200 people became sick from Clostridium perfringens. The illnesses were linked to this holiday Thanksgiving turkey dinner prepared and served at the school. To better understand what happened, public health personnel and researchers in Texas asked the school to recreate what they did. This outbreak wasn't just a cafeteria situation. Because the school was hosting this massive dinner, those preparing the meal also used all the home economics classrooms and even an oven in the teacher's lounge to roast all of the turkeys. They started early in the morning and then transported the turkeys back to the cafeteria when they were finished cooking. The turkeys were then sliced and prepared for service, which was later in the day. All of the sliced turkey sat in chafing dishes for what the research showed was up to 6 hours in some instances. Let's take a closer look at what's happening with the turkey. On the outside of the turkey, after you take it out of the packaging and before you do the roasting, there will be bacterial spores. We'll talk about the specific spores later in this module, but a bacterial spore is just a bacterium that has encased itself in an enclosure and is protecting itself from the environment. It's not growing or able to grow, it's dormant. Spores are really resistant to lots of things. They're very hardy and can survive in soil for years and decades without having any water or food, essentially like a seed. The bacteria go to sleep in this very protective case. In this situation, and most others, our biggest concerns related to cooling, storage, and holding are temperatures. What we are trying to do is control the growth or the waking up of these spores. In this outbreak, it was thought that there were a lot of spores on the outside and the inside cavities of the turkeys. Because they believe it removes some of the bacteria or spores, some people use this as an explanation for washing their turkey or chicken. But you can't do that. Even washing it or scrubbing it with a brush, which could cut up the skin, is not likely to remove the spores. They go into very protected areas within the skin and the cavity of the turkey. You can't do much about the spores. You can't wash them or brush them off. Cooking a turkey to 165 degrees Fahrenheit isn't hot enough to do anything about bacterial spores. It does, however, kill Salmonella and Campylobacter, which are vegetative cells, the type that are actively growing. In this outbreak, when the turkeys were cooked, transferred to chafing dishes, and held at room temperature, the perfect environment was created for the spores to come out of their shells and wake up. The cooked turkeys provided a bunch of water and nutrients for bacteria to use to grow and grow. We now know a lot about the bacterial cause, Clostridium perfringens, and also about bacterial spores and bacterial growth in general through studying this 45-year-old outbreak. There are many other examples of foodborne illness related to cooling or storage. One of these is the story of an outbreak associated with a Minnesota Mexican restaurant in 2002. In this outbreak, there was a complaint filed to the Minnesota Department of Health by a few people that got sick. In total, 10 construction workers got sick after eating lunch at this Mexican restaurant. The cases had some things in common. All 10 workers all knew each other and had all eaten at this restaurant. They all had diarrhea around the same time, the earliest having symptoms 7 hours after eating at the restaurant, and the latest almost 17 hours after eating at the restaurant. Interviews showed that 6 of the 10 workers who had gotten sick had eaten very similar foods, including taco salads, chicken dishes, rice, beans, soda, chips, and water with ice. This list has lots of different things, but nothing that was very obviously in common among the ill workers. After the outbreak, the local health inspector and Minnesota Department of Health inspected the restaurant. They found that rice and beans were being stored in the walk-in cooler, which was an acceptable practice. The cooks would make large amounts of rice and beans and go through it in a 2-day period. The cooked rice and beans were being kept in large pans of various sizes and depths. One of our concerns when it comes to cooling is that the food itself maintains its heat beyond a safe time frame. When it comes to cooling, we want to cool things from above 135 degrees Fahrenheit to below 41 degrees Fahrenheit in a 1 or 2-step process. If we do a 2-step process, we want to make sure that that hot food goes down to 70 degrees in 2 hours, and then from 70 degrees to 41 degrees in another 4 hours. When we're cooling food, we are not able to cool it quickly if the pan is too deep. The depth of the pan and how much it's filled is important, especially in something like rice or beans that is dense, heavy, and does not get much air circulation. If we have very deep, thick foods, we may never get the temperature down below 70 or 41 degrees Fahrenheit in that time frame. Putting large amounts of heavy, thick food into a walk-in cooler and not following proper cooling parameters likely led to this outbreak. As this example shows, depth and air circulation matter. Think back to the turkey example. Some of the most frequently asked questions around Thanksgiving are on how to handle a turkey from a cooling standpoint. Meats, sauces, gravies, and other foods that are very dense need lots of air circulation around them. Rolling a whole turkey into a walk-in to cool down will leave the thickest part of the turkey warm for quite some time. The thickest part could have spores and other contamination in it. Another story comes from a restaurant that was trying to cool gravy. A new employee at the restaurant had rolled one pot with 7 gallons of gravy into the walk-in. The chef came in the next day, saw the pot of gravy in the cooler, and checked the temperature of it with his digital tip-sensitive thermometer. That pot of gravy still had not dropped below 60 degrees Fahrenheit nearly 20 hours after being put into the cooler. Setting coolers to the right temperature also greatly impact food safety. There is a lot of documentation around this, such as in your HACCP plans. The reason there is documentation on these practices is to ensure we have good air circulation and that our coolers are 41 degrees Fahrenheit or below. If temperatures rise to 45, 46, or 48 degrees Fahrenheit, it will be a lot harder to cool food as we go along. In the outbreak we just mentioned, investigators focused on the rice. One of the tubs cooked the previous day still had a temperature of 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The hot rice was placed directly into the cooler the previous day before closing, and the thermometer, although they had one on hand, wasn't calibrated or even being used. There are lots of different types of thermometers available today, but we recommend digital, tip-sensitive, instant read ones, like the blue one shown here, over the traditional STEM thermometer. The major difference is in their calibration. If STEM thermometers aren't handled well and taken care of over their lifetime, they become less accurate than the digital ones. In this outbreak, even if they were watching the temperature with thermometers, which they weren't, their thermometer would not have returned a correct temperature anyway. It would have appeared that they were cooling correctly. We mentioned Clostridium perfringens as the cause of this outbreak. In reality, it was very hard to figure out if it was Clostridium perfringens or Bacillus cereus, another spore-forming bacteria, based on the epidemiological investigation of the illnesses. But it was clear that there was time and temperature abuse of the food with improper cooling. Let's talk more about spore formers. Clostridium perfringens and Bacillus cereus are two that we have already mentioned. Some bacteria, like these two, can live or survive in two different forms. The vegetative cells are the cells that like to grow at room temperature if you give them enough food and water and are already in the right environment. They will double in population every 20 minutes, dividing and making more and more. Another form of the same bacteria is a spore. The spore is this very protected seed-like thing. Vegetative cells can be killed by normal cooking temperatures, but spores can survive the normal cooking process and will wake up as soon as they are in the right conditions. Spores are what we worry about the most when it comes to cooling. Spores, as we just said, are resistant to heat. Proper cooking temperatures range from 135 to 165 degrees Fahrenheit instantly or for 15 seconds, depending on the food. They will kill vegetative unprotective cells, but not spores. They may not be destroyed until they are exposed to temperatures above 240 degrees Fahrenheit. Especially when it comes to roasting something like a turkey, we may set the oven to roast at 375 or 350 degrees Fahrenheit, but the meat itself will not get above 210 degrees Fahrenheit. This won't take care of the spores that are there, so we have to handle the turkey properly after we cook it to reduce the likelihood that someone gets sick. Spores change to vegetative cells. They'll wake up once they're in the right conditions. They need a bunch of water, and some need to be heated up a little bit. Raising the spore above 160 degrees Fahrenheit is actually the right temperature for it to say, "Hey, it's time to find a good environment. It's getting warm again. I'm not in a protected space." Spores grow very rapidly during the cooling process and will create toxins. The toxins are the most important part of the process because we won't be able to cook toxins out of food after we cook it. In other words, reheating food won't kill toxins. Safe handling of cooked foods is really about controlling spores and making sure that they don't create toxins. Where do we find Clostridium perfringens? We find it in the soil and in the gastrointestinal tract of animals. If we think about every meat product that we have coming into our school kitchens, we can guess that well over 90%, but not 100%, of the meats that come in raw have the Clostridium perfringens spore in them. Because we're not able to cook it out, cooling and storage temperatures become so important. Clostridium perfringens is mostly associated with poultry, although we see it somewhat on beef and pork. We also see it on any products that are made with those meat products. Does that mean that if you're using some sort of pre-cooked product that it doesn't have Clostridium perfringens or some other spore associated with it? No, actually, it could still be there, especially if we think about pre-cooked hamburger patties that you might have received frozen and are reheating. If you were to reheat those ready-to-eat pre-cooked patties to just 130, 135, or even 160 degrees Fahrenheit, hold them at the wrong temperature or cool them improperly, and then use them again for further service, there's a possibility that the Clostridium perfringens could be there and survive. We can't stress enough that our only way to really control these spores is with proper temperature control in cooling and storage. Clostridium perfringens can cause severe abdominal pain, and it usually takes 12 to 18 hours, sometimes as early as 5 or 6 hours, to see symptoms. Again, holding temperature and proper cooling is the only way we can deal with it effectively. Bacillus cereus is a similar type of bacteria that we worry about. It is also found in the soil and the gastrointestinal tract of animals, but is much more prevalent in cooked vegetables and cooked rice compared to other spore formers. It is also seen a little bit in cooked meat products. The prevalence of Bacillus cereus in cooked rice has to do with the environment that rice is grown in. The process of growing rice creates a nice environment for the bacteria to live in. As soon as it's taken out of the rice paddy and dried, the process will put all of the Bacillus cereus into the dormant spore stage. Bacillus cereus food poisoning has very similar symptoms: diarrhea, nausea, and vomiting. We typically see these symptoms with traditional food poisoning. When we think back to earlier cases of foodborne illness 30, 40, or 50 years ago, the cause was likely one of these two bacteria. Bacillus cereus causes two different types of illnesses. One is from consuming the toxin directly, where it can make it into our body. The other is from eating the Bacillus cereus bacteria when it is in its vegetative cell stage. When it has reached this point, it will grow in your body. The form that causes diarrhea is the one that grows in your body, while the form that causes vomiting is the one that the toxin is already in the food. Both are very heat stable. As a reminder, we want our TCS, or time and temperature control for safety, foods either below 41 or above 135 degrees Fahrenheit. As we take them through this temperature danger zone and cooling, we need to do so as quickly as possible to reduce the chance we'll get any pathogen growth. Let's talk about cooling practices in more detail. Cool TCS foods from 135 to 41 degrees Fahrenheit or lower in 6 hours. Based on our observations in schools and restaurants, the cooling processes generally get food cooled much more quickly than what the food code prescribes and what's in the school HACCP program. At the very most, the temperature must drop from 135 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit within 2 hours, or it will wake up spores, causing growth of pathogens. Also, you have to drop the temperature from 70 to 41 degrees in 4 more hours. This two-stage cooling process is extremely important and why we have to monitor our cooling. You may be thinking that it's very difficult for you to do this because many of you wash and prep food ingredients later in the day after service and have to then leave for the day. So how are you supposed to know how quickly food is cooling and if you are hitting it right in the two-stage process? We recommend that you know your equipment and do some trial runs of cooling where you can be there for the whole 6 hours to make sure your coolers can get the job done and validate your process. Dr. Ben Chapman will be working with schools in 2016 to help them with cooling. But at a minimum, we need to be doing this two-step process. If food doesn't reach 70 degrees Fahrenheit in 2 hours, it must be thrown out, reheated and used for immediate service, or cooled correctly. This is the only way to eliminate any potential pathogen growth in the food. At that time, we are not yet dealing with any toxins that might be formed. When we cool foods to 41 degrees Fahrenheit or lower, we still have to use those foods relatively quickly. The food code tells us that at the very most, we can't hold that food for more than 7 days. School nutrition emphasizes a shorter storage time of 72 hours, or about 3 days, for properly cooled leftovers. 3 days is the optimal time for that cooled food to be reused or used for service. This comes from concern about the quality as well as the safety of food. Quality doesn't get better with longer storage times. This guideline errs on the side of caution by not allowing extra time for things to grow. The shorter time also provides a small margin of safety for school nutrition. If employees are in the habit of preparing more food than can be served in 3 days, then there is a larger problem of managerial control, control of inventory, food costs, and other factors that come into play. Especially in some smaller facilities, the way foods are packaged in larger quantities may prevent them from being used in a timely manner, and therefore why school nutrition in North Carolina allows for pre-prepared foods. The HACCP plan for North Carolina Public Schools gives a great discussion of the difference between pre-prepared food and leftovers. Even through this process, because we're not working in very sterile lab situations, we may have things like listeria that are floating around in our kitchens and coolers. Listeria is one pathogen that can grow very well under refrigeration conditions. We have to make sure we are on top of our date marking so we don't have foods that are going to grow Listeria. If we freeze the food, we do stop that clock. Listeria does not grow at freezing temperatures, so once we get down below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, or 0 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the ideal frozen food temperature, Listeria isn't going to grow. We only risk quality issues once things are frozen. We need to make sure that when we are mixing foods that come from older and newer items, we use older dated foods first for best quality. Let's take a look at the factors that affect cooling. The size of the container is one factor. Like the example we gave earlier with the gravy, a large container with 7 gallons worth of gravy will affect how long it will cool. The depth of the container also matters. Whether it's a liquid or a solid food makes a difference. Liquids will cool faster than solids. The time it takes for food to cool is affected by whether we're using air in circulation or an ice bath or some immersion cooling. Air will create a longer cooling time. There are many ways to cool things. As long as you're meeting cooling parameters of dropping below 70 degrees Fahrenheit within the first 2 hours and then dropping down to 41 degrees Fahrenheit within the next 4, you can use a variety of ways to cool. With whatever method you use, keep in mind that these factors will affect how quickly things cool. Stirring also increases the cooling rate a lot. The science tells us that stirring will always increase the cooling rate because we're taking the coolest parts from the surface and mixing it together with the warm parts from the inside. One restaurant was able to drop the temperature of a marinara sauce to 41 degrees Fahrenheit within 2 hours, well quicker than the prescribed food code school HACCP parameters. They cooled it by sending someone to stir the sauce every 10 minutes. The sauce was being kept in a 1-inch deep pan in a walk-in cooler. Stirring and moving the outside to the inside really increases how quickly things cool. Using an ice paddle can also cool foods quickly. Ice paddles work by increasing the surface area that you're cooling. All you need is a simple ice paddle that you can freeze. However, make sure it's cleaned and sanitized. You want to avoid cross-contamination between different foods. There are a few schools and commissaries that serve schools that use tumble chillers. These are not very common, but are another way to increase the surface area and chill foods quickly. The best practice for cooling, from a quality standpoint, is to cool food in a cooler using an ice bath or with ice paddles. It is possible to cool things in a freezer, especially if food will be frozen, but the problem with freezers is not that they can't handle the cooling, but that it really taxes the freezer condensers. This happens especially with older units that cycle on and off. Freezers are built to maintain a very cold, consistent temperature, and the more hot items that are put in a freezer, the more problematic it is for the freezer itself. Often we see greater wear and tear and breakdown, especially in older freezers, when people use the freezer to cool hot foods. Coolers, walk-ins, and refrigerators are built for variable temperatures and designed with fans that create air circulation. This makes the cooling process almost as efficient as putting it in a freezer, but creates much less stress on the equipment. The best practice is not to cool food in a freezer due to poor air circulation and the overall design and intended purpose of a freezer. If you overload your freezers with hot foods, you may be able to cool foods to the proper temperature, but it could break your condenser over time. As a reminder, we need to monitor this time and temperature with tip-sensitive digital thermometers as the best practice. Let's summarize the key points about cooling. Bacillus cereus and Clostridium perfringens are spore formers. The spores are not killed or inactivated at normal cooking temperatures, so the cooling process is critical in keeping those specific bacteria from leading to classic food poisoning. We also need to monitor our temperatures and time. We focus on many things when it comes to school food safety and don't always take time to tell everyone, including managers and cafeteria staff, why proper cooling is important. But if we don't cool things properly, we can run into trouble. Now let's switch gears and take a look at storage practices, temperatures, and contamination issues. In 2013, there was an outbreak at a fairly popular Las Vegas restaurant called Firefly Tapas Kitchen Bar. The outbreak caused them to close their doors, and this one location ended up going out of business. 300 people got sick, and the illnesses were linked to contaminated chorizo, a kind of sausage. It was a very big deal and got a lot of media attention and coverage. Ultimately, the situation caused this restaurant to change how it was run. An investigation showed that the cooler temperatures were fine, but the cooler itself was not being managed in a safe way. Cooked chorizo came in contact with raw chorizo and other meats. In the cooler, there was cross-contamination. Raw meat juices were dripping and spilling, and bins where the bottom had touched raw foods had been moved so that they were then touching ready-to-eat foods. In this outbreak, illnesses were only associated with well-cooked chorizo, pointing to storage conditions as the problem. Cross-contamination was likely the cause of this outbreak. It is important to put things into a cooler or dry storage area in such a way that keeps raw and ready-to-eat foods separated. Ready-to-eat foods must be elevated and higher than raw foods so that if something does spill or drip, the juices from those raw foods won't fall on ready-to-eat food that isn't going to be cooked again. As the school year starts and initial orders come in, you have a lot more food to store. There's a tendency to overpack storage areas and coolers, and overcrowding can be a problem. Make sure that everyone who's involved in receiving and storing understands that cross-contamination can easily occur in storage. We want to ensure that we're doing our best to keep cross-contamination from happening. Also consider storage temperature as well as storage contamination. Except for Listeria, all of the foodborne illness bacteria that we worry about, including E. coli, Salmonella, Clostridium perfringens, and Bacillus cereus when they are in vegetative form, Shigella, and Campylobacter, don't grow in our coolers with our products below 41 degrees Fahrenheit. This is why the school HACCP program requires you to have cooler logs that show that you are checking the temperatures. Logs let us know that foods are being kept at the right temperature. If we do them correctly, even a small amount of bacteria that gets in won't grow quickly during storage and become more of a problem. When it comes to food safety in food service, we divide foods into two categories, TCS and non-TCS. TCS, or Time and Temperature Control for Safety Foods, as we've already mentioned, requires some combination of time and temperature to ensure that bacteria don't grow. The simplest way we do this is to hold food below 41 degrees Fahrenheit. We also have time as a public health control, which some schools may be using for things like salad bars. If we hold TCS foods like cut leafy greens, salads, or cut tomatoes at a surface temperature above 41 degrees Fahrenheit, they are still safe as long as we consume or discard them before 4 hours. Salmonella and E. coli are associated with those foods. 4 hours is not enough time for them to grow to numbers great enough to cause a problem compared to the amount of initial contamination. You may still hear the term potentially hazardous foods, an older term for TCS that essentially means the same thing. We stopped using it because really all foods have the potential to be hazardous, and what we really needed was a term to describe foods for which we wanted to control their temperature. What are TCS foods? Great examples are raw meat and poultry, cooked meat and poultry, milk and dairy products, raw shell eggs, uncooked or lightly cooked eggs, raw fish and shellfish, and cut produce. If there are pathogens in TCS foods, they have the potential to grow. All of these have to be refrigerated for safety reasons. Raw seed sprouts are another TCS food. There aren't many schools we know of using sprouts, but if you are using them, they must be refrigerated. Sprouts are higher risk than any other type of produce. A whole tomato, for example, isn't a food we have to worry about for temperature control and is not a TCS food. As soon as we cut that tomato, though, it exposes the moisture inside that can be enough to allow Salmonella or E. coli to grow. We have to hold that cut tomato, as well as other cut produce like cut leafy greens, at 41 degrees Fahrenheit or below. Any garlic and oil mixtures like salad dressings in bulk, although uncommon in school food service, also need to be kept below 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Cantaloupe is another food that we want to highlight. Whole cantaloupe, like a whole tomato, is not considered a TCS food right now for safety reasons. We do keep them refrigerated for quality reasons. As soon as you cut that cantaloupe and expose the flesh to the outside world, it becomes a TCS food, and temperature control becomes important for safety. We often use cantaloupe in things like fruit salads and fruit cups, and it is often held at the wrong temperature. All of those TCS foods that we listed are low-acid foods. The pH of these foods is above 4.6. The picture on this slide shows the pH of different foods. Acidic foods like lemons and vinegar are at a low pH. Tomatoes are tricky because they are sometimes high acid and sometimes low acid, depending on if their pH is below or above 4.6. High acid foods like ketchup, pickles, or cut citrus like oranges are acidic enough such that the temperature they're held at doesn't matter from a safety standpoint. The quality will go bad over time, but in terms of safety, the pathogens that we worry about won't grow in a high acid environment below a pH of 4.6. The foods we listed are also high moisture, high water activity foods. Bacteria need a water activity of above 0.85 to grow. When it comes to water activity and moisture, having a lot of moisture doesn't necessarily mean that something has high water activity. Bread, for example, is quite dry, and even though it has some water in it, that water is bound up and bacteria can't get to it. This means it has a low water activity and is not a TCS food. If we look at something like a raw meat or cooked meat dish, on the other hand, there's quite a bit of water and moisture in it that's available to bacteria to use and grow. Salmonella, for example, doesn't grow below 41 degrees Fahrenheit. It doesn't die below 41 degrees Fahrenheit either, it just won't grow under those refrigeration temperatures. We keep things at refrigeration temperatures to prevent growth, not to kill any of the bacteria that might be there. Salmonella is found in lots of different foods. In the past, we typically associated it with only poultry, eggs, and milk. Now, we are beginning to see it in fresh produce and lots of different foods like sausages. There are two ways people can get sick from Salmonella. The first is by eating contaminated food. If you have food poisoning from Salmonella, you will likely have nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, cramps, and a fever. It usually takes between 6 and 72 hours after eating something contaminated with Salmonella to start having these symptoms. The second way is from an infected food handler. One type of Salmonella, called Salmonella typhi, lives only in humans and is responsible for typhoid fever. A food handler carrying this type of Salmonella can transmit it through food. People with typhoid fever may have a fever and diarrhea and may complain of aches, headache, and sluggishness. Let's summarize our best practices. These are things we want you to be doing when it comes to storage of foods. Labeling and date marking on both your containers and the originals are drastically important. This lets us know how long it's been in there so we know how long it can stay before Listeria can grow to unsafe levels. When rotating stock in storage, use the first in, first out, or FIFO rule. Schedule to deplete your stock on a regular basis. It's not great to always have old stock floating around. Get into this cycle of bringing in new stock right as you use up what you have. Lastly, get rid of food that's past its date mark date. Proper placement in storage is essential to prevent cross-contamination. Separate raw and ready-to-eat foods. Store foods in sealed or covered containers with lids or covers. Keep foods in designated areas and make sure things are clean and dry. We often have pest issues in storage, especially in dry storage areas. At the end of the school year, we start to see more pest problems. They persist through the summer and establish themselves in these storage areas because there isn't much traffic or activity. Look out for pests in storage areas, especially in dry storage, during these times of the year. In dry storage, we want to maintain cool, dry areas that are 50 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Think of your dry storage like a grocery store. It will be slightly cooler than room temperature without much humidity. As soon as it gets humid, the likelihood for quality issues increases. Mold may appear, or you may have other issues. Ideal dry storage conditions are low humidity with temperatures between 50 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit with lots of ventilation and air circulation. Keep food away from walls as much as possible, especially in dry storage areas. When food is kept away from walls, we are better able to look around foods and shelves to see if there are any signs of pests. Also, keep food at least 6 inches off the ground and avoid sunlight as much as possible, because it will increase the likelihood of quality issues. Let's summarize the key points about storage. TCS foods are foods that require time and temperature control. Salmonella is often associated with cross-contamination. Recall the example of the Salmonella outbreak linked to cross-contaminated chorizo. Finally, proper placement in storage is essential, as is controlling storage temperature. In walk-ins and refrigerators, the storage temperature should be at 41 degrees Fahrenheit or below. Feel free to contact Dr. Ben Chapman by email or phone if you have any questions. Thank you for viewing the module Food Temperatures, Cooling and Storage. We hope you will join us again for another module on school food safety.